August 1948, and a young preacher named George Vandeman was preparing to take the pulpit. That was 70 years ago, and since that time, Soquel Camp Meeting has convened every summer. In many ways, Soquel embodies America's camp meeting, a timeless tradition of faith intersecting with culture, pleasure with praise, and truth within tradition. Camp meeting is so valuable we believe it should be shared not just once, but all year long. That is why the Central California Conference leadership team has produced the best of Soquel. Our special made-for-TV editions showcase the best Soquel has to offer, while providing for you the best of Soquel programming from the comfort of your own home. These newly released programs are our gifts to you, and the best part is you don't have to register an RV, pack a suitcase, sleep in a tent, or so much as leave your front door. You can literally go to camp meeting right now from the comfort of that favorite armchair. We invite you today to sit back, relax, let the Holy Spirit in, and enjoy the best of Soquel today.
Another story about God using young people in evangelism. Souls West is Pacific Union's School of Evangelism located in Prescott, Arizona. Every winter, the school sends second-year students out to churches for a 10-week practicum experience in church-based Bible work. Now, Jasmine from Fresno, California, was one of those students. This last January, she knocked on the door of a girl in her late teens. This girl explained to her that her father had died some months previous and that it had been extremely difficult for her to deal with. And she said to Jasmine, her prepackaged prayers that she was assigned to pray didn't offer her any comfort. Jasmine offered to study the Bible with her, and week after week, Jasmine emphasized the love of God, the character of God, the goodness of God. And after several Bible studies, she told Jasmine, I wanted to give up on God, but you knocked on my door. God uses young people in evangelism.
Today's topic is the brain and stressors. And I'm sure many of you have heard many seminars on stress. This is not going to be your typical seminar. I want to share with you some of the latest and emerging research on stressors, how they interact with the brain, and do some comments, make some comments about the difference in how the male brain versus the female brain respond to stressors. Actually, male-female differences is one of my most requested seminars. There's lots of them. I do 10 different ones because there's so much research coming out, and it's fun. The more you understand about how much we're alike and yet how different we are, the better we can interact with each other. And certainly we can avoid jot behaviors. J for jumping to conclusions, O for overreacting, and T for taking things personally. Dr. Hans Selye, as far as we know, was the first individual who ever applied the term stress, which he took from the field of engineering, to human beings. Occasionally people say to me, boy, I wish I could get the stress out of my life. And I say, whoa, 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 whoa. That is not one of my goals, because the absence of stress is death. Stress is living. It's asking your brain and body to do something different, and your brain and body are able to respond. And when that no longer happens, there's no stress and you're history. But while you're alive, unmanaged stress, and certainly negative stress, can lead to any number of illnesses and death. And that can happen with creatures as well as with human beings. Other mammals have brains that are somewhat similar to the human brain, and they can experience stress as well as humans. There are three main categories of stressors. You can take hundreds of stressors and pretty much put them into three different categories. Although, having said that, stress begins in the brain, and every brain is different. Therefore, people respond differently to the same stimulus. Researchers sometimes take 100 people or 1,000 people, wire them up to all kinds of things, machines that will check their heart rate and their breathing and their amount of sweating and so on and so forth, and then they subject them all to the same stressor. And it's fascinating to watch what happens. Some people just shrug their shoulders and say, we can deal with this. And some people become almost immobile. Other people start complaining, why me? Why do I have to deal with this? And a few people outright lose it. And one or two will usually faint. So different brains respond differently. And you do have some choice over how your brain is going to respond. So the three categories we tend to talk about are eustress, distress, and misstress. And note that I'm spelling misstress, M-I-S-S-T-R-E-S-S. Because one of the first times I talked about these three categories, somebody in the audience put up a hand and said, I know all about mistress. My husband's had 2 or 3. I think that's distress. So we're talking about mistress. So eustress is positive stress. Right now, I am under eustress. I'm doing something that for many people is very challenging. Causes my body some stress, but it's positive stress because I am choosing to do it. Nobody put a gun to my head and put me up on the platform. And when you choose to do something and you enjoy it and you have a goal, you really have very little negative impact from that. You hone your skills, you feel good about what you're able to share, and often you really have fun. So there's lots of types of eustress. Going to college is a combination of eustress and distress. Eustress, if you enjoy what you're studying; distress if you're not studying and you're never ready for the exams. Distress is pretty obvious. Any type of activity, anything that happens that gives you negative outcomes that you would really not have happen. Like the earthquake that happened 3.1 miles, the epicenter, from my home. And I got some damage. That's distress. I have no desire to have an earthquake. But if you know how to handle stress, and we'll talk a little bit about in the next section fear and how you deal with fear, because with that kind of stress, there's often some fear. So if you can avoid distress, do so. And then we come to misstress. And misstress is stress that you miss, meaning you don't really understand the implication to your brain and body. You sit in front of the computer hour after hour without getting up every 30 minutes and moving around for a couple of minutes. You have long commutes with lots of traffic. Nothing you can do about it. You feel trapped on the highway. And those are often misstress. And sometimes the misstress is that you have close friends or family members who are very negative in their outlook on life. And you're constantly bombarded with negative rhetoric. And that's very stressful to the brain, because the brain was hardwired for joy. It wants to be happy, does not want to be in a negative milieu. So unmanaged, distress and misstress can cause illness, disease, and lead to death, as I mentioned, both in creatures and in human beings. We typically learn our stress responses in childhood, and we learn them by watching how the big people in our lives handle stress. Researchers are pretty clear that our responses hinge on a couple of things: our perception and our ability to be flexible. When something happens, how do you choose to perceive it? And can you roll with what happens, at least for a short period of time, till you can figure out what you want to do about it? Or can you not? Because it's the trees in a storm that can't bend that get uprooted. And it's the human beings that cannot be flexible that have a lot of trouble. That's one of the things I've learned as I travel around the world and get to share brain function with people. You never know when you arrive at the venue what's going to happen. You never know if you're going to start on time. You never know if the equipment's going to work, and so on. Fortunately, the team we have here pretty much know what they're doing. And that's one of the things that is not a stressor for me, because I trust that they're going to get us through every single session. So far, so good. So when you're looking at stress, the two questions you ask yourself is, when something happens, do I immediately go to a negative perception, or do I just look at it as a neutral event, and then I decide which category does it go into? Is it eustress, is it distress, or is it mistress? And once you do that, you are less likely to jump to conclusions, overreact, or take things personally. Stress is a very relative concept, and I alluded to that when I talked about some of the studies. It's different strokes for different folks, because every brain is different. Stress can be triggered by fear. It can be triggered just by something that's different. A person can experience a stressor when they perceive that they're different from other people. And once you get that every brain on the planet is different, I kind of let that one go. But they perceive they're different, or they're excluded from a clique or a club or something they wanted to enjoy, or they're disenfranchised, or they're scared of the unknown. That's a big one for stress. And if you let that one run away with you on the planet today, there's enough fodder there to be stressed 26 hours a day. What you learned in childhood may be working for you, and it may not be. But the good news is that you learned your stress response to start with. And you can relearn it, unlearn it, develop new behaviors anytime you want to do so. But it's a choice. My artist drew this little cartoon when I said to him, "Can you draw me something that talks about stress?" And so he drew this frightened young man who, in his perception, is thinking, final exams, and maybe I didn't get all my work done. I'm going on my first date. I wonder how that's gonna go. I've got a pimple. I can't go on a date with a pimple. And all of this in one day. Well, that's the tip of the iceberg. So the more you learn to laugh at the vagaries of life, the less stress you're going to have. Somebody asked me yesterday, "How come you're laughing so much?" And I said, "Because I hang around people who are funny." No, the truth is this. I am very serious about life. I am very serious about brain function. I am very serious about how this information has positively impacted my life, and I want to share it. And I'm telling you, I don't take the little vagaries of life too seriously. Laughter is really an easy way to reduce stress, and I find almost anything funny. I purpose not to laugh at a person or a race or a culture or anything like that. But other than that, it's pretty free game. And every time I laugh, I fill my brain with endorphins, so how can you not feel good? The other day, Rico Hill and I were talking, and we'd both done something similar. We had each once asked an audience to smile. Now that was deadly. I'm not visual, but I could sure tell the faces that hadn't smiled for such a long time. The muscles had forgotten how to do it. So we need to take a look at that, because smiling actually changes your brain's biochemistry. and it's a helpful way to reduce stress. The brain is the first body system to recognize a stressor. It recognizes it in a nanosecond. And the minute it recognizes a stressor, which is one reason it's so important to understand the three categories, the minute it recognizes a stressor, it stimulates, it triggers the body's stress response. Now, the stress response is marvelous. It helps keep you alive, actually. However, many times the stress response is triggered by something in your imagination that is not even a real stressor. I remember one time I was lecturing in about the 15th floor of some big office building, and I had to take the escalator up. No elevator was working for whatever reason, so I'm taking all these escalators. And thinking about something else, I tripped, and I ripped my pantyhose. I happen to wear sup-hose, and so when you rip a pair of sup-hose and you're my color, which is no color, it's pretty obvious. So I'm going up to the presentation, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I don't have another pair of pantyhose with me. I'm going to have to lecture with a run in my hose. And I had to take myself in hand and say, it is what it is, let it go. Won't be the first person in the world that ran their hose. So I'm done with the seminar, kid you not. And I said, the host thanked me and so on, and I said, you know, I really regret I stumbled on the escalator and ran my hose. And she goes, where? Oh, it says right there. She hadn't even noticed. And sometimes we think that people are paying more attention to us than they're paying to themselves, and that rarely happens. So, is the stress real or is it imagined? Because you're going to get the trigger for the stress response either way. Once the stress response is triggered, it's going to last for at least 72 hours for one episode. And if you want it to last longer, all you have to do is keep rehearsing to yourself what happened, or rehearse to others, whether or not they want to hear you. And you can potentiate the stress response. Actually, I have met some individuals about whom I question if they've ever their entire lives been free of a stress response. And that is deadly for brain function and for your health, because stress involves all of the brain layers. As soon as the brain initiates a stress response, it triggers the secretion of chemicals that suppress certain body functions. So when physicians say the stress response suppresses your immune system, they're absolutely correct. When OBGYN physicians say the stress response suppresses your ability to reproduce yourself, to ovulate, to create healthy sperm, to get pregnant, they're absolutely right. Because in the midst of the stress response, that's World War III for the brain, and it doesn't want to deal with anything that's not going to help you right now. So it'll shut down the immune system, it'll shut down reproduction, it'll shut down your digestive system so you get terribly constipated, or it tries to get rid of everything because that's much, few less pounds to carry around, so you have diarrhea. So all of this is tied to the brain recognizing the stressor and triggering the stress response. It was only in late 2015 that researchers found that the brain does have an immune system. Up until then, all of the textbooks showed the immune system flowing throughout the brain and body, but usually only about as high as the adenoids or the tonsils. Showed nothing in the brain. And now we know that the 3 membranes that cover the brain and protect it are filled with lymph vessels. So the brain is directly, physically connected to the immune system. And when there is unmanaged stress and that shuts down the immune system, it shuts down the lymph vessel activity to some degree in the brain. That can contribute to all kinds of things, neurological diseases. It can contribute to brain tissue shrinking, and shrinking brain tissue is aligned with dementia, which is not one of my goals. So it's important for me to get clear about how to manage stressors. When the brain recognizes what it perceives as a stressor, real or imagined, it releases something called corticotropin releasing factor, or CRF. It is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone, and when you find a substance that's both, it hits every cell in the brain and body and is very, very powerful. CRF is extremely powerful. It can suppress appetite. That's being looked at now in relationship to anorexia nervosa. It can increase a person's subjective, their personal anxiety, which can continue to trigger the stress response. It provides that short space of euphoria for people who are involved with alcohol habituation. Unfortunately, there's not a brain on this planet that knows when that moment of euphoria stops, because if they did, they could get the moment of euphoria and stop drinking, but nobody knows that. So they feel a little bit better and keep drinking, and then they have all the deleterious outcomes. It increases inflammation in the body, which may underlie all chronic diseases. It is being looked at, for example, in terms of multiple sclerosis, and how inflammation appears to be linked with multiple sclerosis. And CRF, high levels of CRF, have been found in the brains of people with severe depression and in the brains of that have tried to kill themselves or have committed suicide. It's an amazingly powerful substance. When it's released, here's a cutaway of the brain. You'll see the first layer is the reptilian layer, the brainstem and the cerebellum. Second layer is the mammalian layer that all mammals have. First two are completely subconscious. And then you have the neocortex, the third layer, and you've got 15 to 20% of what goes on in the brain that can come to conscious awareness. The CRF is released in around this mammalian layer, and it goes immediately down to the reptilian layer into the brain stem to an alarm center called the locus coeruleus. Interesting brain names, and I don't care whether you remember that or not. I just want you to know that I know it. So it goes down to the brain stem, and the minute it gets to the brain stem, another substance called norepinephrine that is also both a neurotransmitter and a hormone take over. And it telegraphs this stress message to the entire brain. Norepinephrine is linked especially with the fight-flight stress response. And then after that, you're going to get cortisol that's released and adrenaline and so on and so forth. It turns out to be a real cascade of powerful chemicals. Norepinephrine, as it telegraphs this information, creates what researchers called a heightened emotional arousal, meaning everything goes on high alert. And if it is bona fide stress, then that can be helpful in the present moment. If it is not, and it becomes chronic, then that's really deleterious, because runaway CRF, as I mentioned, is a core feature of depression, and it appears now to be a core feature of the suicidal brain as well. So I'd like to point out that researchers are calling a suicidal brain a completely altered brain.
Another story about God using young people in evangelism. Delia was a California Youth Rush student from Fresno, California. She came up to a door and knocked. A man came out and told her in a loud, firm voice that he was not interested in whatever she had. Quietly, Delia handed him a small glow tract and smiled and continued down the street. Just a few short minutes later, she heard a distant voice and realized that someone was calling her back to that same door. The same man greeted her with a completely different attitude, eager to know what it was that she was doing. What had happened? He had read the glow tract that Delia had given him and had been convicted that he needed to give God a chance. By the end of the conversation, he had given enough for an entire set of books for his whole family. Delia praised God for giving her the strength to remain Christ-like in the face of rejection. God uses young people in evangelism.
Greetings and welcome to the Best of Soquel. My name is Ramiro Cano, President of the Central California Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. The pin of inspiration shares the following. The camp meeting is one of the most important agencies in our work. It is one of the most effective methods of arresting the attention of the people. Volume 6 of Testimonies, page 31. The Central California Conference has had a very long tradition with our annual camp meeting ministry. We can trace it back for over 138 years in our conference territory. For the last 70 years, camp meeting has been held in our conference center in Soquel, California, near Santa Cruz. Camp meeting continues to be a transformative blessing, embodying old-fashioned tent revival evangelism while simultaneously sharing God's Word through a variety of inspirational and riveting speakers. Last year alone, the Soquel Camp Meeting pulpit was host to over 71 hours of live television broadcasting for both local and streaming to a worldwide church community of more than 96 countries, transporting the hope of God's soon return and the comfort of Christ's love to the furthest places of the world. It is my honor and my privilege to make the Best of Soquel available to you. At the same time, I invite you to become part of the Soquel legacy by partnering with us in our evangelism fund. Each year, Soquel Camp Meeting goers collect funds to propel evangelism in a variety of ways. To do so, go to Central California Conference's homepage, centralcaliforniaadventist.com. Even $1 a day is of great value to God's work. These gifts are 100% for evangelism. We invite you to also download our app, CCC Space SDA. Through it, you can enjoy many video sermons. We also have a prayer wall where you can submit a prayer request. So dear friends, wherever you are today, I invite you to sit back, let the Holy Spirit lead, be transformed by the message, the prayers, and the testimony segments. Catch and enjoy the Best of Soquel.
Another story about God using young people in evangelism. California Youth Rush student Will John was standing at a door in Bakersfield, California. The homeowner, named Josh, smiled politely but said, "I'm an atheist. I'm not interested in any of your books." But Will John wanted to understand the young man's views, so he asked him, "How did you become an atheist?" Josh explained that he had been raised as a believer, but at the age of 18 had become disillusioned with all his unanswered questions and with the apparent inconsistencies in the Bible. Will John asked what some of Josh's questions were, and on the front steps, Will John conducted a short Bible study. At the end, Josh was amazed at how easily Will John had answered his questions and said, "You must be a Seventh-day Adventist. I've listened to your local radio station before." Before Will John left, Josh agreed to sign up for more information about the Bible. God uses young people in evangelism.
And we do well to pay attention to that, because people who try to kill themselves may not be doing so with cognitive thinking and choice in that top layer of the brain. It may be more connected to the levels of CRF in the brain. There are some male-female differences related to stressors, and I think it's worth pointing them out, and I'm sure it's worth paying attention. Because we're not talking just about the moment of the stressor. We're talking about risks for a major depressive episode that may surface a quarter of a century later, which is one of the reasons it's so important to deal with stress now, so you don't create this slush fund that 25 years later can put you at high risk for a major depressive event. Therefore, I'm a strong proponent, not a component, a proponent of stress management strategies. But they're different for every brain because every brain is different. We can provide general guidelines, but you need to craft stress responses that work for your brain in order to manage these stressors. It's especially critical in the moment for females because they have twice the risk of stress-related disorders as does the male brain. But it's also critical for the male brain because they have increased risk for a major depressive event later on in life. When females are under stress, they're often told something like, "It's no big deal, just get over it," which is very unhelpful. But when a male is in a stress response, and especially when he's depressed, he'll often be told, "What's wrong with you? I mean, pull yourself together, pal. Just get on with life." And that's equally unhelpful because they're dealing with different types of stressors. The researchers were curious about, can we find underpinnings for the difference in the stress now and 25 years later? So they took some rats. Rats make wonderful research subjects, especially when you can't use human beings, because rat brains are very similar to human brains. So if someone calls you a rat, that is a compliment. They are smaller, the brains are smaller. You know, here's a drawing of a rat brain. You can see the brain stem, the cerebellum, and the brain. And there's the corpus callosum, the biggest of the highways that connect the two hemispheres. And you can see the difference in the female and male brains. Yes, there's the brain stem, cerebellum, but a much bigger brain with many more wrinkles, many more gyri and sulci crevices. But the rat brain has similar neuropeptides, 30 of them at least. Peptides, you may remember, are brain chemicals that impact mood. They can be neurotransmitters, they can be hormones. So anything that's both usually falls in the category of a peptide. This is a drawing of one neuron down in the locus coeruleus alarm center of the brain. And researchers say that when the female brain cell encounters a stressor, the alarm center acts macho. You'll notice that there are 3 little green things in this female neuron. Remember those, because they're not doing anything in the female brain, and nobody's sure yet the reason they're just sitting there looking pretty. You will also notice that there are receptor molecules all around the surface of the cell. This drawing has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whatever metaphor you want to use, pick one. I think of them as windows or doors through which substances can enter the cell. And in the female neuron, as it became surrounded with this CRF that's triggered when the brain recognizes a stressor, all of those windows and doors stayed wide open, letting all the CRF just rush into the cell. In the male rat brain, we see something very different. Now we see that those little green things called arrestins are actually doing something. They're slamming the windows shut and pulling them inside the cell. They're closing the doors, pulling them inside the cell. Therefore, if there's only half as many openings to get into the cell, that particular cell will take in less CRF. Not as many ways for it to get in. And the male neuron, because of this special adaptation, because it takes in less CRF, is less reactive to stress in the moment. So the bottom line is, because the neurons have increased reactivity in the female brain from all of the CRF, females routinely overreact to stress in the present moment. And we as females need to own that and do something about it. The male neuron showed less reactivity in the moment because half of the windows and doors were shut and it couldn't take in as much CRF, so males tend to underreact in the present moment. And males need to own that and take a look at how they want to process that. I don't know the reason. Somebody asked me, how come the brains are different? And I said, I should know. We just are lucky to know that they are different. But this is my brain's opinion. If males didn't underreact to stress in the moment, who'd ever join the military? Because most of them join before their brains are even done. You know, your prefrontal cortex isn't done till mid to late 20s. Who would ever go in the service with what you have to deal with? If your brain was done and you didn't tend to overreact in the present moment. In the female brain, because of the lack of receptor internalization, as it's called, and you can go to my website and you can look up a similar set of PowerPoints and you can actually get the reference and read the research. You can understand it. Just remember that receptors are those openings, potential openings around the cell, and because they don't get pulled into the cell in the female brain, researchers believe the female brain has impaired ability to cope with high levels of CRF, which means in the present moment, you need really good stress management techniques. Two examples of those types of researched conditions are PTSD and depression. And for females, everything will seem worse in the present moment. But in the male brain, increased receptor internalization, pulling in the windows and the doors, translates in, the researchers put it very nicely, it translates into enhanced ability to cope. Truth is, they just don't get it in the present moment. They just don't think it's as stressful as it really is. And it makes it appear less intense. Some time ago, I had a man and his wife come to my office. She walked in vibrating, and I thought, okay, some stressor. He walks in nonchalantly, hands in his pocket, walks over, looks out the window. He'd seen me before. He didn't need to look at me. Males don't keep looking at people they've seen before. So, and that's what's the problem with parents and teachers that look at these little boys and say, look at me when I'm talking to you. They don't want to look at you. They've already seen you. Unhelpful. It just increases stress in their brain. However, they're going to deal with it. So I said to her, is there something I can help you with? She said, yes. My husband wants to move his mother into our home. She's never liked me. She's never going to like me. If she does this, my life is over. It wasn't the time to tell her she was overreacting. So he's still looking out the window. I said, talk to me about this. Do you want to live with your mother? Well, he says she is kind of difficult. I ran away from home at 17 because she was such a pain in the patootie. But she's older now, and I mean, how long is she going to live? It'll be cheaper to bring her at our house than get her an apartment. I said, how old is she? He says, 81. I says, that's the new 61. You could be looking at 50 years. I mean, I'm planning to live to be age 122, 165 days. That's a fair piece from 81. So I explained to them she's overreacting. He's underreacting, but how much does he value family life and comfort? Because he might want to take a look at that. I don't know what they did. So the male brain, decreased response in the moment may be more problematic for the male brain over time because they have this increased risk for a major depressive episode down the line. And what is the research about that? It's fascinating. Researchers at the University of Michigan studied stressful life events, SLEs, and the corresponding risk of a major depressive episode 25 years later. And they did it in 2 population groups. I understand they're repeating that with other types of cultures and races, but they started with white males and African American males and broke the data out, of course, by gender and race. So what did they find? They found with females, there was no difference for the risk of a major depressive episode based on race. And when they peeled back the layers of what might contribute to this, they concluded that, in general, females have more coping strategies. Their faith, more of them attend church. In the United States, doesn't matter what denomination you're talking about, approximately 2/3 of congregants will be female. They have better, larger social support networks in most cases. In one study, the average female had 9 individuals that she felt comfortable going to in a period of stress to get some encouragement and ideas. The average male had 1, and that was often his spouse. So he gets divorced or his spouse dies, he's at 6s and 7s because he has no support group. And in this culture, women are socialized to verbalize their emotional state far more than males. Males go act it out, kick the cat, slap the kid, crash the car. And we can take a lesson from each other. The conclusion of the study is what researchers are calling the black-white paradox. Researchers found a stronger predictive role of stressful life events and a major depressive event 25 years later for white males, but not for African American males. So you white guys better listen up. African American males statistically have higher levels of exposures to stressful life events, but disproportionately lower rates of depression. And when that data was peeled back, it looks like they have an increased tendency and increased ability to implement good coping skills at the moment, including positive reappraisal, a sense of hope, humor, the use of humor, optimism, and I would add music. Because if you've ever seen black guys jamming, you cannot stand still. And music is really great for the immune system. In terms of the depressive episodes, major depressive episodes, there's also a little difference between how males and females approach those. Who has the most stress with what? And interesting enough, we've known this for some time, males unfortunately tend to tie their self-worth to how much money they make. And I say, all you guys need to take a look at that. Because in today's culture, that's just up and down all over the board. And human beings are valuable simply because they exist, not because how much money you make. So they have trouble with relation to work, can't find work, low salary, get fired, go bankrupt. They have difficulty with separation from the people they really care about, although you might not know that, because they often internalize that. And they are much more susceptible to depression related to divorce. So women think it's a piece of cake, basically, for men, because men's income varies much less after a divorce than a female. I'm telling you, it's much, much harder on them emotionally. Females have more trouble with conflict, don't like conflict. They have difficulty with serious illnesses like chronic illnesses. If there's a death in what's called their proximal social network, people in their support group, they have trouble with that. Here's the brain stress equation. Only 20% of any negative impact to your brain and body is due to the stressor itself. Did you get that? Only 1/5 of any negative outcomes to your brain and body is due to the stressor. 80% is due to your perception of the stressor and how much importance you give to it. What's its weight in your life? I think that's good news. You know, major stressors, you're going to have some negative outcomes. Maybe you're not going to sleep really well for a couple nights, whatever. But 80% is up to you. We take it right back to thoughts. What are you thinking? What is your perception of this stressor? You may not be able to do anything about the 20%. Of course, I try to avoid stressors whenever I can. But if I can't avoid them, 20% is due to the stressor. I can do everything about the 80% because I and my brain create my perception. Epictetus, 2nd century Greek philosopher. I love to speak to young people, and when I got back from Greece and I'd learned about Epictetus several years ago, I mentioned that I'd been to Greece and learned about Epictetus and his work, and one of the hunks said, "Did you get to meet him?" I always like to point out, 2nd century Greek philosopher. And he's really the one who, that work underpins what I just told you, the 20/80 rule for stressors. He said, it's not so much what happens to you that matters, as what you think about what happens. And when you go to the writings of the Apostle Paul, he says, be anxious for nothing. And people want to argue with me about that. Well, there's some things I should be anxious about. And I said, did anxiety ever improve an outcome? Well, I don't know, but I should be anxious about it. No, anxiety triggers stress. You want to avoid that. Be anxious for nothing. Identify problems, get help as you need to resolve them. Be anxious for nothing. So I thought I'd bring you a few tips with a little humorous twist, my brain's opinion, because it's always easier to remember something when there's a little humor, at least for me. So here's the first tip when dealing with stress. Be careful what you say during episodes of high stress. If you can't be kind, be silent, or at least have the decency to be vague. Kindness, even in times of stress, is one of the characteristics of high levels of emotional intelligence. Just because you're having a bad day does not give you the right to make somebody else have a bad day. And as we learn more about the brain and understand that we have control over very little in life, people who are fearful try to control everything in an endeavor to make themselves feel safer. We have very little control. It's an illusion. There is one thing that we can control. When you recognize a thought in your brain, you choose to hang on to that thought, to continue thinking about that thought, or to choose a different thought. That's powerful. Start using what you can control. Tip number 2, drive carefully, especially when you're coping with stressors. It's not only vehicles that can be recalled by their manufacturer. And I alluded to this when we're talking about male-female differences. Women have been socialized that it's okay to verbalize how they feel and shed tears and so on and so forth. And males have been socialized to stuff it and to act like the big guy. And you see this in preschool. 2 little kids, a boy and a girl, will fall on the playground, and everybody rushes to the little girl who's crying and picks her up and comforts her and says, "It's okay, honey, go ahead and cry, you'll feel better." And they look at the poor little guy who's bleeding on the knees just as badly, and they'll say, "Okay, hop up, son, you're a big boy, grin and bear it." That's insane, because it teaches males to stuff their feelings and emotions, and actually teaches them to develop a slush fund, and we'll talk about this later in another session, a slush fund of unresolved grief. We are doing a disservice to both boys and girls. Tip number 3, stop the mad competitive rush. It's the second mouse that gets the cheese. And it's the early worm that gets eaten by the bird. I joke that I don't wake up in the morning till 10 o'clock. I actually am much more productive if I'm composing music or preparing a seminar or writing a book later in the day. I joke that I've completed entire seminars before I woke up. And some days I look at the proofs and I go, "Oh, did I really say that?" So there's something to be said for missing the cheese and the worm. Tip number 4. Accept that some days you may behave like a bird, and some days you may feel as if you're the statue. Practice mirthful laughter in either case. And you know what I mean. Just chuckle. Either way, it's life. It's a blip on the screen of my day. I refuse to be anxious about it unless it's something I need to deal with right now in order to be safe. And my second question is this going to matter in 12 months? If it's not going to matter in 12 months, I'm not going to spend any time on it. Tip number 5, and I love this. Remember I told you that every brain is the same color. Your brain's about the size of your two fists held together. Gray glove on your left hand, white glove on your right hand, and that's the color of the human brain. And it is not linked with skin color. So I've developed the habit when I meet somebody to look at their brain. And I'm fascinated with human brains and what they say and how they behave. And once I started doing that, I really don't see color. Of course, it helps that I'm not visual. But it's the brain I'm interested in. So tip number 5, learn from crayons. Some are sharp. Some are pretty. Some are dull. Some have weird names. All are different colors. And they all have to live in the same box. When you do large sample studies of skin colors, it's very much like the brain and very much like your thumbprint. They've never found any that in every particular are the exact shade. I don't have any color at all, so I don't have to worry about it. I just try to paint a little on in the morning so that you can identify my facial features from a distance. But it is what it is. All right, let's recap. Stress is part of living. You choose how you're going to perceive the stressor and what you're going to do about it. And the fewer jot behaviors in your life, J for jumping to conclusions, O for overreacting, and T for taking it personally, the better chance you have at managing that stressor using the appropriate strategies that you have developed that work for your brain. It's an individual journey. Nobody can do this for you. We can share information, we can tell you about our journeys, but it is your journey to develop stress management techniques that work for you. Women, remind yourself to stop overreacting. Males, get a clue. If your wife or girlfriend or daughter is off the ceiling, ask her, what's so bad? And then help her look at it in a different way. Thank you.
We would like to thank the constituency of the Central California Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church for making this program possible, and from viewers just like you. Thank you.